Yeah, this seminar is usually in Spanish, but I wanted to invite you, so it's very...
Ya estamos transmitiendo.
Okay, welcome everybody. Today our seminar, Ciencias Atmosféricas para Quedarse en Casa, will be in English because we have a very special guest today. So let me introduce to you that today we have Dr. Jane Baldwin. She is a bachelor in Air and Planetary Science from Harvard University and a PhD in atmospheric science from Princeton University. And she has been postdoctoral research associate at Princeton, and currently she is a postdoc at Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory from Columbia University, studying tropical cyclone risk with Susana Camargo and Ada Sobel. And she will start this summer as an assistant professor of Earth System Science at the University of California, Irvine. So we are very happy to have Jane today here. I met Jane at the Utrecht experiment in 2019, and she's been working in very interesting topics related with climate and large-scale dynamics. So we are very happy to have Jane today. So Jane, welcome to our seminar. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Stop sharing. Could you please share?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. So thanks so much to Alejandro for the invitation to present in this seminar, and I appreciate your patience with me as I present this in English. My Spanish is not very good. My Chinese is a lot better, oddly, but anyway. This work is primarily the result of a series of climate model experiments focused on looking at the influence of mountains in general, but particularly Central American mountains, which can also be called orography, on global climate. This is work I started while I was at Princeton and finished up this year. It's going to be coming out for publication soon, so please look out for that. And I also wanted to highlight this photo in the background here is actually from when I was on the OTRAC experiment with Alejandro flying over Costa Rica. So while I will not be talking about results from OTRAC here because it shows mountains and Central America, I couldn't help including it. So first, I'm going to start out with some very broad introduction about how mountains influence climate. So mountains have long been known to drive key aspects of both local and large-scale climate. And their influence has been studied by climate scientists for quite some time now. In the climate modeling context, and note that in this presentation, I'll often refer to climate models as GCMs, which stands for Global Climate Model or General Circulation Model, but it's GCM either way. Early GCM experiments placed idealized mountains in very simplified climate models and looked at their influence on the atmospheric circulation. Here is a figure showing a study from Carrie Cook and Isaac Held, where you can see the idealized mountain here, and then the contours of potential temperature and the lower atmosphere wind vectors that result. So you can see it's a very significant perturbation to the climate from this individual mountain. We've come some way since these earliest studies, and now we can use more comprehensive GCMs to look at the influence of mountains on a wide variety of climate aspects. I've done a fair amount of work looking at the influence of mountains on regional precipitation. And so as an example, here's the result of a study where we take a climate model with the Tibetan Plateau, remove the Tibetan Plateau, and then look at how precipitation changes. And you can see kind of around the Tibetan Plateau, this ring of precipitation associated with orographic precipitation. You also see this significant drying in extratropical Asia and these farther remote effects in the Western North Pacific. So whether you're looking at, particularly if you're looking at zonal deviations in climate, mountains have a very large effect. So what are the mechanisms by which mountains exert this effect? So one of the main mechanisms for orographic influence is simply their mechanical blocking of the atmospheric circulation. There are also effects like their thermal effects, but I'm not going to focus on those in this presentation. Here, I'm really going to be focused on simply the mechanical blocking. And this you can think of as being composed primarily of two different things that occur. Let's say you have this idealized mountain range, and here what I'm showing in the colored circles is the anomalies of stream function that result from westerly wind, so wind flowing from the west towards the mountain. And you can see in some cases you have what's called vertical deflection. So basically the wind flows towards the mountain, rises up, and then flows down on the other side of the mountain. In other cases, you have horizontal deflection, which is where the wind flows towards the mountain, then splits to the north and to the south. So we're looking kind of from overhead on an idealized mountain here. In many cases, you have a combination of these effects occurring, and depending on the height of the mountains, you also are more likely to have horizontal or vertical deflection. So, we're interested in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Central America because there's been a fair amount of prior work demonstrating this role they have blocking the Atlantic to Pacific flowing easterly winds. So here's a figure from a prior study where contoured is Central American topography, and then the white vectors are the wind stress vectors, and the colors are SST anomalies, or actually just the SST at this time of year, I'm sorry. And so you can see that where the mountains are high, the wind vectors are relatively small versus when there's a gap in the mountains, such as here, the wind vectors are really strong. And when the wind is strong, this cools the SSTs in this region by both enhancing surface heat fluxes and also enhancing upwelling from the deep. So based on prior work, we have reason to believe that the Sierra Madre Mountains, based on their position against the easterlies, might have a very significant impact on climate. So the focus of this presentation is to really understand this impact on climate in more detail, and in particular, its implications for present-day climate modeling. So the key question we're going to address is, how does mountain height across Central America affect mean climate, its variability, and also present-day GCM, global climate model biases? This work was recently accepted at AGU Advances, and I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work, Alyssa Atwood, who's at FSU, Gabriel Vecchi, who's my PhD advisor based at Princeton, and David Battisti, who's at University of Washington. So more specifically, how we're going to think about I want to describe how we're going to think about altering these climate model simulations to look at this effect. And the first thing you need to know about climate models in this context is that the boundary conditions controlling topography are significantly smooth, which we believe likely significantly underestimates mechanical blocking by orography. So let's say you have this idealized mountain here. Mountains typically have these relatively sharp peaks, though it varies depending on the typical mountain. But in any case, these peaks are at a smaller spatial scale than the grid scale of a climate model. So climate models are composed of grids ranging from 200 by 200 kilometers to maybe something like 50 by 50 kilometers. But either way, when you're putting topography into that climate model, what is typically done is you average the observed topography over each grid cell. So effectively, you go from some observed mountain like this to a boundary condition that looks somewhat like this, where in each grid cell, you have this average topography, which is quite a bit lower than the mountain peak height. Now, if you think about the effects of blocking, there's reason to believe that it might be more accurate to capture blocking using a boundary condition that looks like this, where instead of taking the grid cell average topography, we're taking the grid cell maximum topography. This represents kind of an extreme alternate assumption, which we're going to refer to as high topo. This type of boundary condition has been used actually previously in the weather modeling community, but has not been tested extensively in climate models, and particularly not in atmosphere-ocean coupled climate models. So the hypothesis one of the hypotheses we're going to evaluate here is that high topo and global climate models, or GCMs, will better capture the mechanical impacts of orography and improve climate simulation. Okay, so more specifically, what we do in this study is we're going to compare results from 2 atmosphere-ocean coupled GCMs in various observed data sets. The GCMs we use are GFDL CM2.5 FLOR, which hereafter I'm going to refer to as FLOR. This was a GCM developed at the NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, where I was for most of my PhD. It has a 50 by 50 kilometer resolution atmosphere and land, which is relatively high resolution. It actually permits the simulation of relatively intense tropical cyclones, and a 1 by 1 degree ocean resolution. We're also going to use CCSM4, which was a GCM developed at NCAR. It has a 0.9 by 1.25 degree atmosphere and land resolution, so it's somewhat lower resolution than FLOR. CCSM4 is a more typical resolution for the CMIP6, and it has a 1 by 1 degree ocean resolution. And then for observations, we use a variety of precipitation data sets derived from both satellite and station-based observations. Winds, we're going to use NASA's MERA-2 reanalysis. Ocean, we're going to look at some ocean current data from OSCAR. And finally, for sea surface temperature data, we use HADIS and ERSST version 5. So we're going to run control simulations and then simulations of the GCM where we've altered the surface height boundary conditions. Specifically, so here is the observed topography across the world at 5-minute resolution. This is what it looks like in FLOR control. And again, because the topography is somewhat smooth in FLOR control, you can see that you don't reach the same peak heights in FLOR control as you do in the observations. In high topo, again, we've taken the grid cell maximum rather than the grid cell average. And if you look at the difference between FLOR high topo and FLOR control, you can see that topographic height is significantly enhanced in our high topo simulation by up to a few kilometers. This enhancement occurs essentially everywhere across the world. The one place where this is not the case is in Antarctica. This is an artifact of how the model takes in the boundary conditions we feed it and then regrids it onto the grid that actually does the simulation at. But we don't think it has a very large effect on our results, which are focused primarily in the tropics. So we also run experiments with raised orography over only Central America, again, based on our hypothesis that it's the Sierra Madre's position intersecting these easterlies leads it to have a very large impact on climate. So here again is observations for ETOPO 5 over this now more focused region around Central America. I'm pointing out here the locations of 3 lower elevation gaps in these mountains: the Tehuantepec Gap, the Papagayo Gap, and the Panama Gap. FLOR control and the CCSM4 control topographic boundary conditions are shown here. Again, you can see that the peak height is significantly lower, and also these gaps are much less well captured. And here is the floor high topo boundary condition and what we're going to call the CCSM4 ideal cam boundary conditions. So more specifically, again, floor high topo, we have actually elevated orography across the whole world, but we also run an additional simulation called floor cam or CAM, where we've only elevated topography over Central America, but using this same high topo method. So only in floor cam, only over this box have we elevated topography. In CCSM4 ideal cam, we've again elevated topography only over Central America, but we use this somewhat different method. We just elevate the orography to a particular height rather than using this more fine-tuned high topo method. This simulation with CCSM4 was actually originally run for a different study, but it's very useful for our work as well. Hence that, but that's why the method is a little different. And if you look at the differences, again, you can see over Central America, the topographic height is significantly enhanced. So what really we expect matters most for the climate effects of these mountains is what their zonal maximum surface height is. Because again, this blocks tropical easterlies in the way you could think, you know, a wall would be blocking wind. And we do indeed find that these perturbations we've created result in very different zonal maximum surface height across experiments. So here we're averaging the surface height across this red box here in the zonal direction, or we're actually taking the zonal maximum surface height. And the results you can see in this panel. So surface height is on the y-axis and latitude is on the x-axis. And the black line shows the observed topography. And the blue line shows the floor controlled topography. And the turquoise line shows the CCSM4 control topography. So once again, we can see that these control simulations tend to underestimate the height of topography, or at least certainly the height that's relevant for these blocking impacts. In contrast, our floor high topo simulation, which is shown in gray, has a height that much better mirrors the height of the observations. Floor cam follows floor high topo, except once you are outside of Central America, then it reverts back to floor control because again, floor cam, the perturbation is only made in Central America. And then CCSM4 ideal cam has the biggest change in this very particular region, which is kind of coincident with where the gaps exist. Okay, some other final methodological details before I dive into results. So all GCM simulations are run with 1860 radiative forcings, and the perturbation simulations are branched from 1860 control simulations that are spun up for a few thousand years. The model results are calculated from about 200 years of model data for each run. So since these are fully coupled simulations, you need a fair number of years to beat down the noise and really understand what the statistically significant effect is. The differences between data sets that I'm going to show, if they're not significant at a 90% level based on a two-sided t-test, we've simply masked them out. So all the results you can see for most of these figures are only the statistically significant ones. And I'm going to plot, results are going to be plotted as perturbation simulation minus control simulation, which you can think of as the influence of raising orography on climate. So imagine you're starting from simulation with no mountain, suddenly the mountain is uplift and the climate equilibrates around it. What is the change in climate that's occurred? That's what we'll primarily be plotting. Okay, two more things. Unless otherwise indicated, the results are shown for March, April, May, which stands for MAM. We look at this region because this is when the double ITCZ biases tend to be worse and the effects of raised orography are greatest. So ITCZ stands for the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And for climate models, there's a long-standing problem where we tend to have too much precipitation in the southern hemisphere and not enough in the northern hemisphere in the tropics. And It's important to note that the GCM parameterizations we use are tuned for the control simulations, but not altered from the control tuning for the perturbation simulations. So we expect, if anything, if we see improvement, it's to some degree an underestimate because we're using GCMs that are tuned around the standard topography. Okay, so finally diving into results. So first, let's look at the change in wind and SST biases in the tropical East Pacific from raising Central American mountains. So this plot shows the GCM biases in wind speed to start. I'm going to show SST in a moment. Biases are typically shown as control minus observations, or simulation minus observations. I'm showing them here as observations minus the simulation because that should correspond with what we expect the mountains will do when we uplift them. But in any case, we can see that in both FLOR and in CCSM4, there's this substantial bias where the wind speeds tend to be too strong in this region because the easterlies basically can blow right through this relatively bias low topographic area. Now, if we raise the mountains, which is shown here in the first panel, using FLOR high topo, FLOR cam in the second panel, and CCSM4 ideal cam in the third panel, we see changes in the wind vectors and the wind speed. So the wind vectors are shown in these black contours, and they mirror what's going on with the biases. So when we elevate the mountains, we see a decrease in easterly wind speed. And we also see just a decrease in wind speed overall. So the takeaway from this is by elevating these Central American mountains and this Eastern Pacific region, we're significantly improving decreasing wind speed biases. Now, this leads to decreases in SST, sea surface temperature biases as well. So in the simulations, we have this significant cool bias in the SSTs in this region. Again, this is -1 times the GCM biases. But if we look at our GCMs with the elevated topography, we can see a significant warming due to the elevated topography. And again, this is due partially due to the decrease in wind speeds, decreasing surface and latent heat fluxes, and also decreasing upwelling, which all contribute to the warming in this region. Okay, so there's another mechanism, though, where the mountains are able to change the SSTs beyond just the direct surface heat fluxes effect. There's also this kind of farther afield effect where the mountains actually change the ocean current circulation. In particular, we find that raising Central American orography leads to increase and improved Northern Equatorial Counter Current, or NECC strength. So the North Equatorial Counter Current is this current, I'm plotting zonal currents here, where red demonstrates eastward currents and green shows westward currents. So the NECC is this red band you can see here in observations from Oscar. In the FLOR control simulation, the NECC is biased to weak. However, in FLOR high topo, we see that the NECC becomes significantly stronger. And a lot of this increase is also captured by FLOR cam, though not quite all of it, but the vast majority of it. You can also see this clearly if you look at zonal means of the zonal current. So here, again, the observations are shown in black. The FLOR control simulation results are shown in this blue line, and the red lines show the FLOR high topo and FLOR cam results, which are better aligned with the observations than the FLOR control. So altogether, this is relevant for SSTs and turn any precipitation effects that result because the strengthened NECC increases advection of warm waters from the warm Western Pacific and leads to more warming of the tropical East Pacific beyond what we already saw from the changes in the wind vectors and surface heat fluxes. So why do we see this improvement in the currents? Well, this is consistent with Sverdrup theory, which basically says that the existence of this current results from the wind stress curl. So here again is that plot showing the improvement in the zonal mean of zonal current. And here's a plot showing the meridional derivative of the zonal integral of wind stress curl based on Meritude data in the black line. And then again, blue is the floor control and red are the floor high topo and floor cam simulations. So according to Sverdrup theory, this should determine where this current occurs. And we find that in floor high topo and floor cam, we have better alignment of this peak of this meridional derivative of the zonal integral of wind stress curl than we do in the floor control, which we believe can explain this improvement in the ocean currents. Okay, so now what's really interesting to look at is what happens with precipitation, because again, that's where some of the most problematic biases are in climate models. And we find that following the circulation, atmospheric circulation, SST improvements, raising Central American orography leads to more realistic tropical East Pacific precipitation. So here I'm showing on the left precipitation, again, March, April, May mean in the floor control and CCS and floor control. And this is the bias compared to observations, shaded with the floor control and CCS and floor control contoured. And you can see what's basically the double ITCZ bias, or at least a significant part of it here, where you have too much, or you have too little precipitation in the north and too much precipitation in the south. Yes, that's correct in these climate models. So then when we raise the topography, we see both an increase in precipitation to the north and a decrease in precipitation to the south, both where we've elevated topography everywhere. We see most of this response by only elevating topography over Central America, and we see a similar result in CCSM4. So what this is indicating is that a significant portion of this double ITCZ bias, which is a significant problem in climate models in this region, can be improved by just elevating Central American topography. And this is notable partially because previous work has suggested that biases in this region might be at least partially related to the Andes, but because there's only a very marginal improvement in precipitation by adding in the rest of topography beyond high topo. So that's if you're comparing this panel and this panel look relatively similar, which basically is showing us that Central America's effect really matters a lot more than the Andes in this region. Okay, so let's look at some zonal means of precipitation, because again, that's often how the double ITCZ bias is shown. So here's the annual zonal mean of precipitation. The black lines are 3 different observed precipitation products. The blue line is the floor control. The red line is floor high topo, and the dashed red line is floor cam. And we can see that in our perturbation simulations, precipitation in the northern to the north is increased to be more in line with observations, and it's also slightly decreased in the south to be more in line with observations. And we see similar results in CCSM4. What's more impressive is if you look at March, April, May, which is when the double ITCZ bias tends to be worst. And you can see that in floor control, you actually have a peak in precipitation to the south when there should just be a peak to the north. And when we elevate the topography, if you go from the blue lines to the red lines, you significantly increase precipitation to the north and decrease it to the south. And we see a similar effect in CCSM4, where actually by elevating topography, we can switch from a southern hemisphere peak in precipitation to a northern hemisphere peak in precipitation. So final, I want to show two final results, and then I'll wrap up. So when there's a lot of research indicating that when you improve, reduce biases in the mean state, so the mean state of SST and winds and precipitation climate models, you also tend to improve their variability. And indeed, we find that the El Nino Southern Oscillation does improve in some distinct ways in these simulations. So here I'm showing in these lines here where the shaded area around it is uncertainty. I'm showing the seasonal cycle of ENSO variance calculated based on Nino 3.4 index. So the gray lines are observations, and the blue line is floor control. And it's a little bit hard to see, but when we go from the blue line to the dashed red to finally the solid red, which is floor high topo, we gradually become more in line with the seasonal phase locking of ENSO. So having this peak in November, December, and this minimum in kind of April and May. We also see, if we look at total variance, floor control tends to have too much variance of ENSO, and we can decrease it significantly when we elevate topography over Central America, and then even further if we elevate it over the whole world. So if we look at CCSM4, we see a similar result where, again, the seasonal phase locking of ENSO has improved. The total variance of ENSO doesn't actually improve that much in CCSM4, though it's worth noting that the bias was not very large to begin with in CCSM4 in total ENSO variance. Okay, and one final intriguing aside, so I've really focused on Central America in this presentation and the Eastern Pacific, but this method of raising orography, this high topo method, also reduces pervasive wet biases, so too much precipitation biases in Western North America, which are likely due to higher Rockies. So here's the floor control precipitation here, and this is -1 times the GCM bias from floor control. So you can see that floor tends to have too much precipitation in Western North America, which really matters because this is a region where there's a lot of concern about their change in water resources with climate change. Now, if we look at floor high topo, we can see that floor high topo minus floor control, the improvement in Western North America quite closely mirrors what this bias is. So indicating that if you elevate this topography, you can significantly improve the bias in this region. In contrast, if we look at floor cam in this region, it slightly improves the precipitation, but really it seems that it's more a local effect of topography and not impacted so much by what's going on in Central America in this particular region. Okay, so to conclude this study, we find that Central American orography has outsized impacts on tropical Pacific winds, SSTs, currents, precipitation, and ENSO due to its placement intersecting the tropical easterlies. These results are robust across 2 AOGCMs, so atmosphere-ocean coupled GCMs with different structures and resolutions. And it's also worth noting, again, that Central American orography seems more influential than the Andes because previous work tended to focus more on this impact of the Andes. Interpolating orography to preserve mountain height, which is this high topo method, we find is a simple and physically motivated method that can reduce GCM biases. This is interesting because the primary method that's been used to deal with these subgrid scale mountain biases has to do with improving subgrid scale parameterizations that pertain to topography. I think there are 2 different ways of interpreting this result. One is that perhaps those parameterizations aren't doing enough. Another, and we need to improve those parameterizations. Another way is, well, maybe it's interesting to think, though, how far we can get simply by interpolating this orography differently, just like this high topo simulation. this method is distinct but complementary to ongoing efforts to solve these problems via improved parameterizations of convection, clouds, and ocean processes. And I think it's important to give if we can make the topography more realistic in a way with regard to mechanical blocking, then maybe we can create better parameterizations for other things in climate models as well. However, we shouldn't expect raised topography to improve every aspect of climate simulation. Indeed, there are some things that might get worse if we have higher regions, broad higher regions at high elevation. Okay, some final thoughts. Relatively small orographic features can have quite large climatic influences contingent on their placement relative to the larger scale circulation. I think this steps us beyond prior studies that focus on just removing really large orographic features like the Tibetan Plateau. And there are a number of other studies I could refer to that are reaching similar conclusions. Atmosphere-ocean interactions should be considered to accurately understand the impact of mountains on climate. Most prior studies looking at the impact of mountains occur in atmosphere-only simulations, which, as you can see from these results, have some distinct limitations. And for future work, this is an area I'd like to delve into further, and some particular questions I'm interested in are, again, resolving how does raised orography resolve precipitation biases in Western North America. I'm currently talking with some scientists about NCAR about pursuing this further. To what degree does the reduction in biases from high topo boundary conditions alter projections of future climate? We actually have some simulations done already to explore this, and we're hoping to analyze them soon. And then finally, what is the optimal interpolation of orography to preserve effective mountain height and reduce GCM biases that could be used operationally in GCMs? I think this is an interesting question to ask alongside, again, the development of topographic GCM parameterizations that deal with subgrid scale topography. Okay, so thanks so much for listening. Please reach out to me at my email, and also please come visit me at UC Irvine starting around July 2021 when I'll be there. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Jane, for your excellent presentation. My name is Christian, for those of you that don't know me. I would like to invite everyone to make their questions. Please raise your hand in the participants box so I can unmute your microphone. Any questions? Please don't be shy. Jane will be very happy to answer any questions. Or if you have questions, you can write the question in the chat box. That could be your work. Okay, Dr. Graciela has a question. I will unmute the microphone.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't find the hand to raise it. Sorry. Thank you, Jane, for the presentation. It was super challenging to follow. A lot of things that you packed there in a very short time. And there, a lot of the things were a little fast, but please confirm that in some grid cells, the height of the topography was raised by about a kilometer or more. Is that correct? Did I see it correctly?
Yeah. Okay. So it's raised by, maybe a few kilometers in some grid cells. And again, that's simply by, rather than averaging the observed topography to create the grid cell height, you take the maximum observed height across the grid cell area, basically. So you can think of it as what's the difference between the peak height in a grid cell and the average height across a grid cell in the observations.
Right. So that was a significant raising and blocking of the winds. So this mechanical blocking was very significant. And I can imagine that it makes a difference in the wind stress over the ocean. So that was fascinating, but we don't have time now, but we will in the future. I wanted to ask you, you did not show any of the thermodynamic variables, because I would imagine that the blocking also has implications to the thermodynamics, because one thing is to flow smoothly over a very shallow barrier, or to have to go around because of Root number or something like that, right? Because we have the trade winds, capping, inversion, and all those kinds of things. So what did you see in terms of thermodynamics compared to, observations, say, from Mera, I suppose?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the main thing we were focused on in this study, the short answer is we haven't looked at that in detail yet. The main thing we were focused on in this study was kind of what was happening at the atmosphere-ocean interface, because there had been some prior work looking more at specifically just the atmospheric circulation response to these mountains. But I think if you have any suggestions of analyses to examine that direction that could be interesting, I'd be all ears on that front.
Yeah, because not only the ITCC has a bias, but also the precipitation distribution over the continent, over the isthmus, is not captured properly. So it has to be related to the topography issue as well. And but we can talk about later. I see other hands raised now. One last thing that I wanted to ask you is vorticity over the Northeast Pacific distribution and role in tropical cyclone, because you showed March, April, May, but what happens later in the season, like July, August, September?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've analyzed carefully not these particular simulations, but some similar simulations where instead of altering all the topographic height, I just fill in the gaps in the topography, because we're interested. There's a lot of literature suggesting that these topographic gaps play an important role in spinning up tropical cyclones. And the interesting thing we find in those simulations, which if I had another half hour, I would have discussed, is that if you do an atmosphere only simulation where you're basically prescribing the SSTs, then we see a significant decrease in tropical cyclone genesis from filling in those gaps. So that suggests that if you raise the mountains, you decrease tropical cyclone genesis because you have lower vorticity in the East Pacific. However, if we look at these simulations in atmosphere ocean coupled context, what we find is actually hardly any change in tropical cyclones due to altering the orography. And we think this is because you do have this vorticity effect, but there are also thermodynamic effects on tropical cyclone genesis. And when you raise the orography or fill in the gaps, they end up being kind of a similar thing. What ends up occurring is you're warming the sea surface in this region, which increases potential intensity, which leads to further tropical cyclone genesis. So it's basically an effect that goes against the effect you're having on the vorticity. So that's like, I just went through a lot pretty quickly there, but it seems like if you look at this atmosphere ocean coupled context, which hasn't been done that much, it might be that these mountains don't matter that much climatologically for tropical cyclone genesis. I think they could still matter at a synoptic time scale, and sort of disentangling those two is sort of confusing. And anyway, something I'm still thinking about and trying to figure out. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna let other people ask.
Yeah, and sorry, by the way, if I packed too much in there. I apologize for that.
Okay, the next question is from Luis Ladino. Please go ahead.
Hi, Jane. Thank you very much for your presentation. So it was really nice to see the work that you have been doing recently. So you nicely show that when you improve the orography or the mountain height, the model comes closer to the observations, right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
in conclusion, you say that besides the mountain height, there are other parameters like such as convection, clouds, and ocean processes that can somehow impact the precipitation, right? So given though, as I said, with this modification that you made, you are closer to the observations. However, they don't perfectly match. So what do you think is the missing part there? Or what do you think is somehow the most important driver there that is very key for the precipitation? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's the $1 million question. So I think there's a lot of evidence that, at least for the double ITCZ bias, there's significant issues with how convection and clouds are simulated in climate models that are likely having a big role in this bias. And this is I haven't done work specifically on how clouds are impacting these biases, but I think sort of the answer that's commonly given is that these sort of biases in the stratus cloud decks in the off South America are having a really significant role in these precipitation biases. And indeed, most of the improvements we see to precipitation are in basically enhancing precipitation to the north. And while there is some decrease of precipitation to the south, it seems from these mountains, there's still further bias there. And I think it probably lies in problems with the clouds. But again, that I haven't directly explored that question. That's just what I've seen in related literature.
I see. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, we have two more questions from the chat box. The first one is from Dr. Rosario Romero. She says, why choose the MAM period if the gale winds are more intense in winter and their influence on SSTs is more evident and precipitation is minimum?
Wait, I just want to look at that question once more. Why choose the MAM period if the gap winds are more intense in winter and their influence on? I see. So the reason why we look at MAM is because that we focus on that period is when the double ITCZ bias, so this very prominent GCM bias, is the worst. So that's the period we care the most about the mountains being able to do something to improve precipitation. I've looked at other seasons as well. And what I can say is the improvement is somewhat less dramatic in those other seasons, but there's no season where the mountains make things worse. They always having the higher mountains across all seasons tends to make things a little bit better in the GCM.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is from Joanna. She's watching the video in YouTube and she's asking, why did you say that the Central America topography is more influential than the Andes topography?
Yeah, so I'm not sure it's more influential for the specific thing we're looking at. So in our simulations, we are interested again in these biases in precipitation in the Eastern Pacific, which are pretty ubiquitous across climate models. And what we find, so we did two experiments. We did one where we elevate only Central America and one where we elevate topography everywhere across the globe, including the Andes. And what we find is looking at the East Pacific, the improvement in precipitation we see in the simulation elevating only Central America is very similar to the improvement when we elevate topography across the whole globe, including the Andes. So because they're so similar, that suggests that the Central American effect in the region is really dominant, and whatever additional effect you have from the Andes in the complete high topo everywhere around the globe elevated simulation really is not having a very large effect. This is notable because actually David Battisti, who's one of my co-authors, wrote a very prominent paper that was published in, I think, 2007, arguing that the Andes being too short was having an important role in these biases. And we find that actually in the end, and he wrote the original paper and is now a co-author on this one, that Central America seems to be playing a bigger role. And I think part of the reason that maybe its role has been unappreciated in previous work is, for a while, I mean, GCMs are always getting higher and higher resolution. So there was a period of time when GCMs really couldn't simulate the Andes or its Central American topography very well at all because it's so fine. And while they still have biases, at least we can get enough of the topography there that we can, perturbing it does make an impact, versus the Andes have been like pretty large in climate models for a while.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jane, for your time and for answering all the questions. So
yeah, sure, my pleasure.
It's all from me, and Alejandro will share something. Go ahead, Alejandro, please.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I really like your presentation. It was very interesting. I have some questions, but we don't have enough time, so I hope we will keep in contact because this topic is really interesting. For all of you that are watching this seminar on YouTube and here in Zoom, we know that we are very curious and very interested in this topic. So here in this slide, you can see Jane's webpage. So you can keep contact with her and you can ask her more questions. I guess this is your current webpage, so we'll be able when you go to University of California at Irvine. Is that right?
Yep, that's going to be my webpage for a while. So, or that link will work for a while.
Okay, so that's a very good option for all you that want to keep contact and ask more questions. So you're very welcome to follow this link here. Also, we want to thanks Jane again for accepting this invitation. It's an honor for us to having you here. We want to, I'm going to skip just a little slides in Spanish. It's for all you are following us and follow this seminar. You can register to this link here, so you will receive future emails about the future seminars. And if you want to keep in contact with us, you can write and propose a topic for a future seminar. You will be very well. You are very welcome to do this, to propose a seminar in our future sessions. And for Jane and all the people are looking at watching this seminar, our center has an online journal. It's a peer-reviewed journal. It's open and it's free. It doesn't have page charges, nor for authors, and not even for people, for the public. So you will be very welcome to consider this journal for your future publications. It's peer review and is increasing. We have an opinion section that we will appreciate. If you are interested in writing some more like divulgation, you can write an opinion section here in this journal. So you will be very welcome to consider this journal for future publications. And of course, for all the people that are following this seminar, our center has different online seminars like the Que Onda con el Tiempo about the weather forecast for Mexico, and is on Thursday every 15 days. And also we have the seminar on Fridays about the research that is being done in the center. So you will be very welcome to follow these seminars. And please keep in touch with our social networks on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Again, thank you very much for being here today, for watching this seminar, and you will be very welcome to keep with us in the future seminars.
Yeah, and please, if anyone has any questions or